On today's show, how can your favorite NHL team streamline its prospects development? All that and much more on Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, I break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalakash. I'm a scout and prospect analyst across multiple platforms, including this one. I've got a very packed show for you today. First and foremost, we'll be touching on how your favorite NHL team would be able to streamline its prospect development process and produce more high-end prospects as the years go by. Then later on, we'll sort of review the top 5 under 22 AHL prospects currently playing in the American Hockey League. There's a lot of names to go through. It's going to be some honorable mentions as well. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And then finally, we will be looking at some mailbag questions that you guys have sent my way over on Twitter. Now, if you want to be part of these mailbag questions, you can follow me at HattieK_scouting. And you can follow the podcast over at LO_NHL prospects. It's a great source for information. I tweet everything from prospect rankings to updates, all that stuff. Everything goes on the podcast as well. You get, daily updates when the podcasts come out. So if you follow us there, you'll be able to also participate in these mailbags and be part of the action. So before we get into any of this, just remember to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube and to make us your first listen of the day on all of your favorite podcasting platforms. It is very much appreciated. So let's get right into it. How can your favorite NHL team streamline its prospect development system? So I started asking myself this question after watching an interview with a legendary French footballer, Thierry Henry, where he talked about his time at INF Clairefontaine, which is an elite academy for 13 to 16-year-old French youth from the Paris region. It's produced many of the top French talent in Europe. Everyone from obviously Thierry Henry, Nicolas Anelka, another legendary French footballer, and more recently players like N'Golo Kante, Paul Pogba, Karim Benzema, and a lot more. So one thing that Henry mentioned that was that his coaches went to him one day and just straight up said, "You can't use your speed to beat defenders anymore. You aren't allowed to do that." And he was baffled because that was his thing. He was the fastest player on the field at all times. So he was confused as to why they would ask that of him. But the result of him not being allowed to use his speed was he had to think. He had to use his off ball positioning and be a great player away from the ball, away from the play in order to score. He couldn't just burn past guys regularly. There was another time where they told him that he's not allowed to pass backwards anymore. And that was just absurd to him because as a striker, he often played on the defensive line, stuck to the defenders with his back to the play. So that severely limited what he was allowed to do in his usual position. But instinctively, because of that restriction, Henri started playing closer to the midfielders, receiving passes higher up the field, and then turning around, scanning for pressure, and then making a play. So there's one thing that Henri said specifically related to that really struck me. And he said that humans adapt by nature. You prevent them from doing something, and they're going to find a way to adapt to that instinctively. And my coaches knew that. That's a direct quote. So he went on to talk about the fact that when you're bigger and stronger and faster than everyone else, you tend to rely on those things in order to drive your success. So when you reach a level where you're not the fastest anymore, you're not the strongest, you're kind of left with nothing. And his coaches knew that. So they knew to make him adapt mentally to the game, force him out of his comfort zone, force him to do things that he's not comfortable with. So these limitations that were imposed by the development coaches at Clairefontaine made their prospects think rather than rely on their strengths. So what they were nurturing in these young footballers was a concept called adaptability. And that's where hockey and NHL player development comes in. If you have a big guy who can score like Reed Schaefer of the Edmonton Oilers or an extremely quick skater like Fabian Lucelle of the Boston Bruins, the problem is usually that they're not adaptable. They rely on those things so much. They've been so used to being the strongest or the fastest players on the ice that they haven't been well prepared for the inevitable time where they're not going to be the fastest or the strongest, either at the AHL or NHL level. So, what your favorite team can take away from INF Clairefontaine's model is to construct drills and give instructions that will force these prospects to adapt. So, what would happen to Fabian Lucel, for example, if you told him that he isn't allowed to burn defenders off the rush anymore? Well, he would have to adapt his game, and how he would do that is probably by delaying, cutting to the inside, adding slip passes and area passes to his arsenal, passing more often, and using his off puck movement to create space for himself. All that would sort of appear in his game and become a regular thing if you simply instruct him to not use his speed and use his mind off the rush. He would be forced to adapt. So another example, if your players work well with open ice and little pressure, which most forwards do, most players in general do, you can construct drills that are going to force them into a small area of the ice. So, for example, you cut the ice in quarters and you assign a quarter to 7 or 8 of your players. Let's say four forwards, 3 defenders, and that is going to force them the hard way to play the right way when they've got 2 players that are at least 2 feet from them at all times. In terms of opposing players. So, what your team can do to streamline their prospects' development, it's simple. They can put together drills that are going to force their prospects to let go of their biggest strengths and force their natural adaptability to take over. That's how you add layers to a prospect's game. It reminds me of something that I heard Adam Nicholas of the Montreal Canadiens say. He's their director of players development. He was coaching the prospects at prospect camp in July or August, and he said, "I want the jungle. I don't want a zoo." And then he points to a player and says, "You got to know a couple guys who can dangle but aren't really good in the game, right?" Well, that's because they train in the zoo. So the point of all this is to say that the best way to streamline your player development system is to recreate the jungle in your practices. That's the best way to do this. That's it for our first segment. Now we're going to head into our second segment where I break down the top 5 under 22 AHL prospects right after these messages. First off, I want to talk to you about Simply Safe. In the last decade, over 4 million people have chosen Simply Safe home security to protect their home. If you got that many people on board, you're definitely doing something right. Simply Safe's priority is your safety. They protect you using cutting edge security tech powered by 24/7 professional monitoring agents who've always got your back. I love what Simply Safe has to offer. From crystal clear HD live stream of your security cameras to full control of your system from your phone with their app, and smarter ways to detect real break-ins so you aren't pestered with false alarms while you're going about your workday. They've got sensors for everything from burglaries to fires to floods and other threats to your home. They've really got you covered. You can customize your perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplysafe.com/lockedonnhl. You can save 20% on your Simply Safe security system when you sign up for an interactive monitoring plan and get your first month free. Visit simplysafe.com/lockedonnhl to learn more. Again, that's simplysafe.com/lockedonnhl. There's no safe like Simply Safe. All right, so for our next segment, I wanted to talk about some of the best AHL prospects that are of the ages of 21 and under. There are a lot of names to go through, so I just want to go through the criteria first, just to sort of break this down for you before I get into the names themselves and what they've been doing. So the cutoff is 21 years of age. Anyone above that is excluded. It's the rankings are weighted for age as well. So an 18-year-old that's producing well gets more recognition than a 21-year-old that's producing well in these rankings. And 2 more criteria: they have to be currently in the AHL and they have to have played more AHL games than NHL games. So first, we'll start with the honorable mentions. There's Jacob Pelletier and Connor Zary of the Abbotsford Wranglers, their Calgary Flames prospects. I didn't include them in the top 5, even though they're among the top scorers. First, because they're both pretty old, and also the fact that they're playing on a team that is very successful offensively. They've been riding shotgun to Matt Phillips on some games, and Matt Phillips is the best scorer in the AHL by a wide margin. So it just kind of felt unfair to the other guys who aren't necessarily being carried offensively by other sources and sort of benefiting from that. Got Xavier Simoneau of the Montreal Canadiens. He's one of those guys. He's just 21, almost 22. Even though his point production is high enough, there were many better prospects to include in these rankings. And 2 more, and Luke Evangelista, who's been doing pretty well, but just barely missed out, and Ridley Gregg of the Ottawa Senators, who's been injured since mid-November, and that makes him kind of difficult to assess. But another player who barely missed out on these rankings. So let's start with the fifth overall prospect that's under 21 years of age in the AHL right now. That is Yuri Kulich of the Buffalo Sabres. He's got 14 points, 5 goals, and 9 assists in 20 games played. He's 18 years of age. He's fresh off his draft year, and he's already matched his point totals that he had last year in 49 games in the Czech Pro League. So he's gone from a league that is, admittedly a pro league and is difficult to score in, to going to the AHL, which is probably the second or third toughest league in the world. And he's already matched his point totals in 29 fewer games. The progression in his game is really good. I think that his intensity, his speed have been up to par. He's got some decent skill, but what's really sort of made him so good so far as his defensive game, and I already pointed it to his defensive game in his draft year as something that is really high end, really sort of valuable in his game. But it's just been really obvious this year in Buffalo. I've really liked the way that he reads players off the rush, that he, defends in his own zone. He's very positionally sound, understands his role in the defensive zone really well. So that's been really impressive to watch from Yuri Kulich. Then at fourth overall, we've got the LA Kings prospect, Jordan Spence. He's got 2 goals and 6 assists for 18 points in 19 games played. He's a defenseman, 21 years of age. I love the speed and vision that he brings to the game, especially from the blue line. He skates the blue line really well, opens up lanes, and uses his vision really well. So that's been really impressive in his case. I was already a fan of his back in his draft year in 2019. He was already someone that I was looking at as an interesting sort of mid-round pick. He went to the 4th round to the LA Kings. He went in that range. So that was someone I've been sort of looking at regularly to see the progression in his game. It's been really great to watch him grow and succeed. He's already played 24 NHL games last year, and it's just a matter of time before he's up again. Then we go to the third best prospect in the AHL right now. For me, it's David Jiricek, who was a 6th overall pick in the most recent draft. He was called up for 2 NHL games in late October. Didn't put up points, was sent down pretty quickly after that, but he's got 6 points in 7 games since getting sent down. He's almost at a point per game pace right now as a defenseman. He's another player who's fresh off his draft year, so that ups his sort of value in this range. He's been playing good physical hockey, using his shot to create offense, and he's got great vision and playmaking, and that's been pretty obvious as well. I like his chances of becoming a number 2 and number 3 defenseman at the NHL level, but I think he's still at least, this year he should spend in the AHL just to sort of round out his game, make him more polished, even maybe improve his skating in the offseason and see how he goes next fall. That would be my prognostic for David Jiricek. Then at number 2, we've got the former 2nd overall pick of the Los Angeles Kings, and that is Quinton Byfield. Now, Byfield has been at a point per game in the AHL since being sent down. He's played 9 NHL games and 10 AHL games, so he makes these rankings. He's got 7 goals and 3 assists in 10 games so far in the American Hockey League for the Ontario Reign. He is tremendously gifted offensively, just so smart, so shifty. He's very hard to limit at the AHL level with the puck. He doesn't need to add some elusiveness, some agility, and a bit more of a delay game in order to really be good at the NHL level. But I think that these things are going to come with age. He's already sort of smart enough to make it work at a high level in the AHL. And I really think he's going to have a great NHL career, and sort of, drive his numbers higher and higher as the years go by. I think another year in the AHL might be good for him, but in fall of 2024, 2025, I would see him have, his jump into the NHL and produce at a top 6 level. Then we go to the best prospect who's under 22 years of age in the AHL right now. And for me, that is Lukas Reichel of the Buffalo Sabres. He leads all under 22 AHLers with 23 points in 19 games played so far on the season. He is insanely relentless. He never gives up on plays. He's always fighting through checks and barreling his way to the net, creating chaos. And on top of that, he's a great stink handler. He's a great shooter, and he earns his fair share of assists by wreaking havoc in the offensive zone. So I think that Reichel is going to be a great top 6 piece for the Sabres down the road. So again, number 5, Yuri Kulich. Number 4, Jordan Spence. Number 3, David Juracek. Number 2, Quentin Byfield. And number 1, Lucas Reichel. If you make the count, that's 2 LA Kings prospects and 2 Buffalo Sabres prospects in the top 5 of my personal rankings for the AHL's under 22 prospects. That is really good. Both of these teams have a great young core of prospects who are coming up and working their way upwards, and it's going to be very impressive to see them in 4 or 5 years time when these guys graduate and make their way to the NHL as regulars. They might be two of the most interesting to watch young teams in the NHL. That's it for our second segment. Now we'll go into our mailbag questions featuring some of my followers on Twitter right after these messages. All right, so for our final segment, I just wanted to answer some mailbag questions from our followers over on Twitter. There's a wide array of questions here. Most of them relate to the 2023 draft, which is pretty topical. We just put out the rankings yesterday. The video will be linked at the end of this one. So let's start with this question by Graham Slam on Twitter, who asks me, what is your opinion on Lukas Dragicevic? I feel like the points are a bit misleading with him. I'm not too sure about misleading with Dragicevic. He's probably putting up more points than he should, given his skill set. But I really think that the offensive skills with Dragicevic are impressive enough that he's in my top 15 right now, and it's because he's able to do a bit of everything and drive offense in a productive way for a team that doesn't have the firepower of some of the top teams in the WHL. He's one of the point leaders on the Tri-City Americans. He's trusted in all offensive scenarios. He's out there on the first power play, connecting plays. His playmaking is really solid. I really, really like his vision, especially in the offensive zone when he's got all 5 of the opposing players or all 4 of the opposing players on the power play in front of him. A very translatable offensive game. He does need to work on his consistency in zone. I feel like the score sheet sort of masks that part. He's not the most solid or outstanding defensively. There were some games this year where he really looked like a top 10 pick because of having that offensive element on top of having some good defensive performances, but it's really inconsistent in this case, and it's kind of limiting him from being one of those bona fide top 10 prospects. Then the Habitant asks me, do you think Dalibor Dvorsky still goes top 10, or do you think he'll continue to slide? I think Dvorsky's going to start sliding pretty soon. He's on 5 games pointless right now. He's not really able to produce or contribute offensively. He's making mistakes defensively. There are, decision-making issues that are pretty glaring in Dvorsky's case. I don't think he's necessarily the most sound decision maker in any of the 3 zones. It's very inconsistent across the board, so I'd see him slip out of my top 10. He's 9th overall right now, but with the recent performances that I just caught up on, it's looking kind of rough in his case. I wouldn't be surprised to see him slip further than that. I don't think he slips outside of the top 20. He's good enough that, he's offensively skilled. He's got a great shot, great pace to his game. But there's the inconsistency factor. So I don't think he slips out of the top 20, but he definitely keeps slipping if he continues to produce like this. Moving on, a Rosa by any other name, like that name, by the way. Who would you rather put in Team Canada's and USA's roster, and who would you have them replace on their current rosters? So first, I mean, I've seen Team Canada's roster and I've studied it pretty well, and there are some glaring misses. First and foremost, Jagger Firkus is not on the roster. I don't understand how that doesn't happen. For me, he's a lock. He's been probably the best offensive producer out of the 2022 draft, heading into their draft plus 1 year. On top of that, they left Denton Mateychuk and Brant Clark off of their list, and neither of those make sense to me. I mean, both of those guys should be locks, and instead they've got guys like Jack Mateer, who's been playing pretty well, but the most glaring one for me is Tyson Hines in the QMJHL. He is nowhere near the level of Denton Mateychuk or Brant Clark, and I just don't understand that omission. On the USA side, the only guy that I'd say was really surprising to not see on this roster would probably be, there's 2. I think Jack Hughes should have been an option for sure. And the other guy would be Oliver Moore. They invited Charlie Stramel and they invited Charlie Stramel and Gavin Brindley and Ryan Leonard and Will Smith, but they didn't invite Oliver Moore, which is pretty interesting to me. To have that many, 2023 NHL draftees in their roster and not include Oliver Moore, who's probably been the second best US NTDP player for me. It's just very strange. So that's really kind of what I've studied for the moment, but I'm probably missing some names. I haven't really reviewed that too much. Moving on to Gabriel Ferland, who asks how many prospects of this year's draft would have been in contention for first overall last year. There are five, maybe six for me so far. Definitely Bedard, Fantilli, Michkov, Leo Carlson as well. Zach Benson is on the bubble. Andrew Crystal as well as on the bubble. I'd even include Edward Chalet in there. So 5 to 7, I would say, would sort of be probable first overall picks if we're looking at last year's draft. Now, moving on, we've got Brady Piercy who asks, who could be the biggest positive surprise outside of the first round? For me, it's got to be Jaden Perron. Perron is a very small prospect who's got a lot of skill. He's playing on a team that isn't scouted as much as the NTDP and the Chicago Steel. They're still one of the premier programs in the USHL, but they're not really scouted as much as the NTDP and other sort of programs. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Jaden Perron go in the mid-second round and end up being one of the top producers from his draft class. He's really that good. I love his shiftiness, his goal scoring ability, his stick handling. He's got a lot of offensive skill and the brain to go with it. He's been really impressive. Then Gleb Cherkazov, another name I really like. Which players do you see teams reaching on, and which ones do you see falling, and what do you see being the reason they rise or fall? Could be based on how they played, or size, or shot, etc. So if you look at my personal rankings, I think Matthew Wood would be a guy that gets drafted higher than he should. He's the type of guy who could even sort of potentially contend for 10th, 11th, 12th overall if teams aren't smart with their picks. Um, you know, he's a guy, he can score, he can shoot. He's about average everywhere else, but that's the thing. He's a specialist. So I don't really see any more value than where I have him at 17th overall. Another guy who can get drafted higher than he should is Cam Allen. I think teams will be sort of desperate for a right-handed defenseman and see his pre-draft year production, his Hlinka Gretzky production, and be sort of higher on him than they should be. For me, the decision-making issues, the inconsistencies, the defensive mistakes are way too glaring for me to even include him in my top 32. So he's a guy that might get reached on as well. One guy that's almost definitely going to fall further than he should is Andrew Crystal. Crystal for me is the sixth best prospect in this class, and he's pretty comfortable there. But he could end up going in the mid-teens to early 20s, which would be much further than he should be. Guys like Caden Price, Jaden Perron, who I mentioned earlier, Will Whitelaw might not even get drafted in the first 2 rounds if teams aren't careful. He plays for the Youngstown Phantoms, which is not the best program by any margin, but I really like his skill set. Denver Barkey is a first rounder for me. Luca Pinelli as well. There's a lot of guys who I'm higher on than I know most teams are because of size, and because of their skill set. It's unfortunate that so many skillful players get drafted so low, just due to their size. I understand that it is a factor you need to keep in mind, but still. Moving on to NHL Princess, who asks, who's the best Leaf prospect and why is it Ty Voigt? Good question. For me, Ty Voigt is the best Leafs prospect for one simple reason. Right now in the OHL, he has more primary assists than anyone else has assists, period. So he's been extremely impressive in terms of his playmaking. It's so versatile as well. I think he can hit any pass at any point. There's very little that teams can do to limit his connectiveness, especially in the offensive zone, especially off the rush. His shot isn't the best, but he's got great pace, great playmaking. He could end up being a very, very solid prospect for the Leafs moving forward. And then finally, Chris with 2 S's asks, what do you think about Callum Ritchie's start to the season so far? Are you concerned by his low offensive production? To be, very brief and frank about it, no, I'm not. Yes, he's got, 21 points in 24 games, I think, but he's one of the smartest and most tenacious players in this draft, on top of just being so versatile. He's almost definitely going to be an NHLer. He has a B game, a very solid B game as a bottom 6 player, but his A game would almost definitely be a top 6 or top line energy forward who's going to do a bit of everything, make plays, shoot well, all that stuff. For me, the quality of Callum Ritchie goes way beyond just his production. And I think that production is a bit overrated when it comes to prospects sometimes. That's going to be it for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching and hanging on all the way to the end. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platforms, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. And thank you so much for listening. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all of your news updates on all of your favorite leagues. They're the best way to stay up to date and be the smartest person at your water cooler on breaks. Now, this has been Locked On NHL Prospects with Hadi Kalakesh, and I hope you tune in next time.